Welcome to the Joshua Ngoma Podcast for spiritual inspiration and Africa's strategy positioning in global politics.
Civil rights in the United States. The Africans survived and overcame 1 century of colonialism. Ghana was the first nation to gain independence by breaking away from British colonial rule in March of 1957. African Americans were only allowed to vote and became citizens of the United States through the enactment of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was a follow-on bill to the 1964 Civil Rights Act by Congress after 14 generations of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. With the official ending of apartheid in April of 1994 in South Africa, organized and imposed rule or oppression by one nation or group of people on Africans was officially overcome. In the United States, civil rights organizations increased pressure on President Lyndon Johnson's administration, resulting in the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights of 1964 was birthed during John Kennedy's presidency after he got elected the 35th President of the United States in 1960. Kennedy's support for civil rights was thin in the previous years, and he had opposed President Dwight Eisenhower's 1957 Civil Rights Act to keep in with the Democrats' ranks, as Kennedy, as well as Johnson, had plans to run for president. In 1957, President Eisenhower sent Congress a proposal for civil rights legislation, which resulted in the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The new act saw the establishment of the Civil Rights Section of the Justice Department. It empowered federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions against interference with the right to vote and established a federal Civil Rights Commission with authority to investigate discriminatory conditions and recommend corrective measures. However, Congress weakened the final act due to a lack of support among the Democrats. The Civil Rights Commission of 1960 handed the new President Kennedy indisputable facts about the conditions of Black America. They found that 57% of African American housing was judged to be unacceptable. African American life expectancy was 7 years less than whites. African American infant mortality was twice as great as whites. African Americans found it all but impossible to get mortgages from mortgage lenders, and property values would drop a great deal if an African American family moved into a neighborhood that was not a ghetto. Redlining is a term used for an illegal practice where people living in a certain area or neighborhood are not given the same access to loans and other credit services as people in other areas or neighborhoods on the basis of race, color, national origin, or some other prohibited reason, regardless of their ability to repay their loan. Redlining makes it harder for people in those neighborhoods that are redlined to buy homes. Although redlining continues to affect neighborhoods today, there are consumer protections in place to prevent the practice. Redlining began in the 90s during a period when the federal government was trying to encourage people to buy homes to help the United States economy recover from the Great Depression. The government offered incentives like low interest rates, meaning it cost less for people to borrow money to purchase their homes. A government manual on home loans considered race and ethnicity when judging whether to approve mortgages and advise separating racial groups. Shortly after noon, on November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated as he rode in a motorcade through Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas in the state of Texas. Kennedy's assassination shook the world. Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, suddenly found himself president of the United States after being sworn in as president on Air Force One. Earlier, Johnson did what he politically needed to do to stop the full implementation of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Johnson was from the state of Texas and feared a political backlash from his home state. But with the shock of Kennedy's assassination and him being president, Johnson took the lead to push for a major Civil Rights Act of 1964 to advance African Americans within United States society as part of what he was to term the new vision for America, the Great Society. However, the 1964 Act resulted in an outbreak of violence in the southern states. White racists launched a campaign against the success that Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists had in getting African Americans to register to vote. The violence reminded Johnson that more was needed if the civil rights issue was to be suitably settled. Johnson introduced to Congress the idea of a Voting Rights Act in what is considered to be one of his best speeches. Quote, "Rarely are we met with a challenge to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation. The issue of equal rights for American Negroes is such as an issue. The command of the Constitution is plain. It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." End of quote. With this commitment to the cause, Congress realized that Johnson would not back down on this issue. If they hindered or failed to back it, Americans would view the failure to be won by Congress alone. The act was passed. It outlawed literacy tests and poll taxes as a way of assessing whether anyone was fit or unfit to vote. As far as Johnson was concerned, all you needed to vote was American citizenship and the registration of your name on an electoral list. The courts of law would tolerate no form of hindrance to this. The impact of this act was dramatic. By the end of 1966, only 4 out of the 13 traditional southern states had less than 50% of African Americans registered to vote. In 1968, even hardliner Mississippi had 59% of African Americans registered to vote. In the longer term, far more African Americans were elected to public office. The act was the boost that the civil rights cause needed to move it swiftly along, and Johnson took full credit for this. Martin Luther King Jr. had predicted in the earlier years that peaceful demonstrations and marches would serve a good purpose. He also insisted that real change would only be effected through the power of the federal government by legislative change. As a Democrat president, Johnson worked with a majority Democrats Congress and worked well together in passing groundbreaking legislation. In 1968, another Civil Rights Act was passed which prohibited racial discrimination in the sale or rental of houses. Signs such as "Negroes need not apply" were no longer tolerated in a society that became more and more traumatized by the Vietnam War. Thank you for watching and listening. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Joshua Ngoma Podcast. Bye for now until next time.